City nonprofits and the people behind them. KC Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and the profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This KC Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. I'm Ruth Bombigas. Many nonprofits are started because of the passion of the founder to help the community in some way. While noble in purpose, there are many things to consider, including legal issues and obligations. When the word legal is mentioned in the same sentence as nonprofit, it may send shudders up the spine. But our guest today on this Ask the Expert episode is here to ease your worries and break things down for us. KC Cares welcomes Danielle Merrick. She is a University of Missouri Kansas City professor in the School of Law and a director of the Kansas City Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts, and many other things that Danielle is involved in. That's just a snapshot that I thought we'd start with. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All
How
right.
are you?
I'm doing well. Well, as I said, legal may send those shudders or spook or scare some folks who go in and they want to help heal somebody, raise money for some other. Where does someone start with legal issues and a nonprofit? Bring us in.
So the first thing is that there are a lot of resources in the Kansas City area that can assist you with both information about how to form a nonprofit and do it properly, and then also with maintaining that nonprofit. So one of the places that I recommend on a regular basis is the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership, also Nonprofit Connect. So the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership is a program that's actually through the Block School of Business through UMKC, and it puts on, I believe it's quarterly. They put on quarterly basically, so you want to form a nonprofit class. And I believe it's maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours long. And they have a legal nonprofit expert that comes in and just talks about the basic building blocks about setting up a nonprofit. They also talk about kind of the sorts of planning that an individual or group of individuals needs to go through to successfully form a nonprofit. So if you are someone that's in the very beginning stages, in the what I like to call you God told me to do X stage, then that's a great resource is to start there to kind of get some of that exposure to that. Nonprofit Connect and Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. Nonprofit Connect is basically an affinity group for individuals who are already either involved with a nonprofit, whether that be as board of director members or executive directors or founders or whatever. And it provides a few things. It provides a networking platform. They have events where you can network with other nonprofits so that you can kind of compare war stories. They also put on classes and events that are designed to educate people on nonprofit best practices. So like the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership has a fundraising certificate. So if you have a board or an executive director member who wants to be more savvy at fundraising, there's a fundraising program that they can go through. Nonprofit Connect puts on similar classes like that. So I always say, do that first if you're starting at that. The next thing that I would suggest is that one of the things that people don't really understand about nonprofit is that, two things. One is that nonprofits are owned by the people of the state in which they're formed. They're not owned by any one individual. So one of the things that I tell people when they're thinking about forming a nonprofit is you have to decide whether or not your primary goal is for this to be your baby and you control it, or your primary goal is whatever the mission is, and the mission might go on without you, and you might not be involved with your nonprofit at all in the future. So you have to decide which is more important. And there's not a right or wrong answer to that, because some people are like, no, this is my baby. I want to always be involved in it, and I never want to be parted from it. And if that's the case, then a for-profit structure is probably a better structure for that. But if it's more mission driven and your personal affiliation with it is not as important, then a nonprofit structure might be the right way to go. The second thing that a lot of people don't understand about nonprofit is that the legal work to set up a nonprofit is like the last 10%. 90% of it is all y'all. Like, you've got to come up with your budget. You've got to come up with your programming. You have to figure out your board of directors. You have to do all of that. The lawyers are not going to do any of that for you. Nobody's going to come to me and go, I'd like to set up a homeless shelter. And we go, okay, yeah, I know exactly how you want to run this. And let me just, dictate everything to you. I'm going to go, okay, great. Tell me all about your homeless shelter. And if you say, well, I don't know, I haven't decided, I'm not charging for my services with all of my clients. So all you're doing is wasting some time. But if you're paying an attorney, they're charging you for you to fumble around and not be able to tell them what your program is. So, really kind of doing that research ahead of time and really knowing a lot of those types of things before you go consult with an attorney to start setting things up will save you money. It will save you time, and it'll save you frustration. So I recommend all of those things when we first are setting up a nonprofit. Just as a total complete aside, and you're probably aware of this already, given that you interface with nonprofit stuff on a regular basis, is that Kansas City has a lot of nonprofits, like a lot.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
A lot. And, some people could say that that's the generosity of the Midwest and the generosity of the city as a whole. But it does create problems. There was a study by Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. I believe it was in 2019, maybe 2018. All I know is it was before the pandemic versus after the pandemic. And it basically said that due to the number of nonprofits in Kansas City, all these existing nonprofits are essentially competing for the same 43 individual donors. So my thing, when anybody approaches me about starting a nonprofit, the very first thing I ask them is, have you volunteered with a nonprofit that's doing what you're doing? Is it possible there's a nonprofit you could already partner with and be a program under an existing nonprofit, as opposed to setting up a fully formed secondary nonprofit? And that should always be anybody who has a great idea that they want to help somewhere in the community. That should always be their primary prong of focus. Is there somebody already doing this or something ancillary to this that I could expand on and just assist that mission, as opposed to diverting dollars to the administration of another nonprofit? So, that all being said, when I get a nonprofit client in, I usually spend the first 30 to 45 minutes trying to talk them out of forming a new nonprofit.
Oh, no.
But, sometimes there are reasons that partnering with another organization doesn't work, or maybe, they have been very involved in what they've been doing and have been doing at a grassroots level for several years, and they just want to formalize it. And so there are reasons why they might want to form a nonprofit anyway. Nonprofits in both Missouri and Kansas are under corporate law, which seems a little weird, but that's how it is. Missouri and Kansas are slightly different. Missouri has set all of their nonprofit corporate law into a whole separate section. Kansas is stupid sometimes, and I can say this because I live in Kansas. Kansas was like, no, we're just going to smash the nonprofit corporate law into the for-profit corporate law, and we're going to call it zero par value stock that gets issued. So Kansas nonprofit law is a little bit more strange, a little less straightforward than Missouri is, because you're inside of a for-profit law. So if you are someone who's interested in forming a Kansas nonprofit, I absolutely suggest that you not try to do that on your own. Only because there are so many nuances in Kansas nonprofit law, because it's mashed into the for-profit law, that makes it a little less straightforward. So both of them are under corporate profit law or corporation law. The main thing we do is we We file articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State to set up a nonprofit corporation. Now, the nonprofit corporation form on the Secretary of State's websites, they have gotten so many people who form nonprofits and don't actually know what they're doing, that they have put the language in the instructions of the PDFs of those that has all the language that the Internal Revenue Service requires for your nonprofit to be considered eligible for tax exempt status. Now, that's the next misconception that people have, is that there is a nonprofit corporation and then there is tax exempt status, and these are two separate things. You could have a nonprofit corporation that is not tax exempt. You can have a tax exempt entity that is not a nonprofit corporation. So most people, when they tell me they want to start a nonprofit, what they actually mean, what they're colloquially referring to, is a charitable nonprofit corporation that is eligible for tax exempt status under 501c3 of the IRS code. So the IRS requires specific language in your articles of incorporation and in your bylaws for you to be eligible to apply for tax exempt status. So if upon forming your nonprofit corporation, you fail to put that language in, whatever attorney you meet with is going to have to tell you that we're going to have to amend your articles of incorporation and amend your bylaws before we can even apply for tax exempt status. So it's really important, if you are not aware of what that language needs to be in the articles of incorporation, go look at the instructions on the Secretary of State's website for the PDF of those forms. It's right there. The language is right there. Or ask someone, try to find out what the language is supposed to be, because that going back and having to amend that sets off a whole series of processes that delays your application for tax exempt status. So, we're always trying to make sure that, if you're going to do things on your own, we're giving you the best start. You're trying to, get as many things squared away properly to begin with. So once you've set up your articles of incorporation, Missouri and Kansas have different requirements for the number of board members. Missouri requires that you have 3 board members at all times. Kansas requires 1. Both require that you have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. And those can be 3 individuals that fill those roles, or it can be 1 individual filling all 3 roles, like the Trinity. And so normally, the persons who are filling those roles are members of the board of directors, but they don't have to be. They could be outside persons that are not on the board of directors. That does create a level of complication that most attorneys would not recommend that, but it's not illegal to do it that way. So what happens if you have less than 3 board of directors in Missouri? Or what happens if you have less than 1 board of director in Kansas? That means that technically you're not in compliance with Missouri or Kansas statute, which means that your limited liability under that nonprofit corporation no longer exists. So what that means is if you're a Missouri nonprofit operating with only 2 board members instead of 3, your board members and your executive director are now personally liable for anything that happens.
Big no.
Yes, exactly. So it is very important that you understand, in whatever state you're formed, what the requirements are to maintain your nonprofit corporation as well. One of those is the board of directors, but then the other thing is that Missouri and Kansas both, for nonprofit corporations, require an annual report with the Secretary of State. If you fail to file that annual report, they will administratively dissolve your nonprofit corporation, and then you're back to individual personal liability for everyone affiliated with the organization. So once you've done that, you've got your things set up, you've solicited your board of directors, now you need bylaws, and now you need a conflict of interest policy. And your bylaws are, the best way I can describe bylaws is they are a contract between the board of directors and the nonprofit organization as to how the nonprofit organization is going to be administered. And so the bylaws are describing like, here's how often we're going to have board meetings, and here's how we're going to elect people, and here's how we're going to remove people if we need to, and here's how we feel if someone just leaves or whatever. And it's a whole layer of things. 2 hints about bylaws. Number 1, nonprofit corporations that are tax exempt have a higher level of required disclosure than a privately held for-profit corporation. That means that as a taxpayer in the state of Missouri, I can ask any existing nonprofit for a copy of their bylaws, or a copy of their articles of incorporation, or a copy of their recent tax returns with the IRS, or copies of their most recent board minutes. And they have to provide them to me. So one of the things that I tell people who are trying to figure out how to set up bylaws is I'm like, find a big organization that does something similar to you and request a copy of their bylaws. Because now you know they've paid an attorney to look at them. And now you can kind of see how they structured stuff. That doesn't mean you have to structure everything the way that they did, but it gives you some insight into,
right,
well, how do I want to do some of this stuff? The biggest thing that happens with that I see the biggest mistakes I see with bylaws is the bylaws are drafted and don't account for proxies or electronic participation in meetings.
Yes.
So, if your bylaws don't contain that, you technically can't have a Zoom board meeting. You technically can't have a teleconference board meeting. You technically can't have someone vote on behalf of somebody else. And so making sure that those are included in new bylaws, if you're drafting, is very important in this day and age to make sure that electronic communication, proxy, all of that stuff is in there. The second most common mistake I see with people with bylaws is they don't follow them. So,
yikes.
Yes. So whatever your bylaws say, you have to do. I would say that the most common question I get from existing nonprofits is they'll say, can we do X? And my most common response is, what do your bylaws say? And if their bylaws say they can do X, they can do X. If their bylaws are silent on that or say they can't do X, they probably can't do X. And so, being familiar with your bylaws and knowing what you can and can't do, and then abiding by them is very important.
I find that I have to go back because it's not something I think that you easily memorize. I'll speak for myself. It's not something absolutely. I keep top of mind because you're busy doing your mission. If, though, it isn't in your bylaws and you want it in your bylaws, can you amend them? And how difficult is that to do?
So, yes, you can. Even if your bylaws do not have a stated amendment policy, most bylaws do. But for some reason, if they are silent on the amendment, there is never a situation in which you cannot amend a document. So let's pretend it's silent. The default rule is that you can amend it as long as a majority of the board of members agree to amend it in writing. So those are the key things, a majority and in writing. They can amend the bylaws. Now, if you have a membership-based organization, that's a little different. If it is a membership-based organization, and let me be clear, there's a difference between membership for marketing versus membership in a legal structure. Membership for marketing is like, I'm a friend of the zoo and I get a couple of zoo passes, but I don't get to have any power to vote in the board of directors. That's a marketing membership. Legal membership is I have a membership-based organization like a homeowners association or a country club or a social league, and the members get to vote in the board of directors. So if you have a legal structure that has members, then amending your bylaws will also require the majority of the members to approve in writing the amendment to the bylaws. And then you call a meeting, you present all the amendments, people vote, bang, your bylaws are amended. The most common amendments that I've done in the I've been an attorney for about 20 years now, and the most common amendments I do is adding proxy and electronic communication, like electronic meeting. That's the most common. Occasionally, we've done some things where we've either added in term limits or removed term limits. But for the most part, the most common thing is changing the way that voting and meeting structures happen. Because especially organizations that were formed, early aughts or before, electronic meetings and electronic communication just was not something that was regularly included in bylaws.
Is that something at this point, if somebody was forming, or let's say they've decided they're going to take a look again, that you would recommend that you go ahead and do? I mean, we're in this world of Zoom and Teams and everything else. And I know for us, for example, during the pandemic, we had to, you couldn't gather unless you decided you're going to go stand on a driveway and you could all vote and do that. I don't think many of us probably did that. So tax exemption status, you really need to be clear about. You really need to know your bylaws. You really need to know your articles. What are those big, step in the mud kind of things that you see nonprofits kind of just either don't pay attention to or aren't, what are those big mistakes we make?
Mm-hmm. So I see a few. Nonprofit boards tend to have a decent amount of turnover. And so in that turnover, if there is not someone who is the keeper of the records, sometimes records just get lost in the turnover. One of the ways that I suggest nonprofits can help avoid that is having your nonprofit organization pay for a business Dropbox or a business OneDrive or a business box or whatever Google, whatever file system you like to use, whatever, one is your favorite. They're all apples, right? It's just like whether you like Galas or Pink Ladies or Honeycrisp, they all have the same security. They all have the same functionality. It's whatever one you prefer. Setting up something like that, paying for the business subscription so you don't have to worry about, we've run out of room or whatever.
Right.
And then every person who is a member of the board has a login to that business, online file system. That way, when Susie Smith leaves the board, we just deactivate her from OneDrive, but all the stuff that she ever put in there is already up there. So the next person who comes in her place can go in and be like, oh, well, here are all the minutes, and here's the bylaws, and here are all the amendments to the bylaws, and here are all the tax returns, and all of that type of stuff. So having some measure of internal controls in terms of document retention and things like that, that makes your life so much easier. And digitizing, we have so much readily available technology to digitize that stuff at this point. And the more you can digitize it, the easier it is to keep everybody on the same page and to have everybody have access to the same thing. So that's one thing I see happen a lot, like especially organizations that were formed prior to the pandemic. I'll have organizations that come in that they were formed in the 90s and they're like, we know we have bylaws, but no one can find a copy.
Where are they? So
we pretty much have to start over and draft new bylaws because nobody can find a copy of the original bylaws and we have no idea what they are. And so that's one of the things that happens a lot. The next thing that I see happen a lot is just general internal control issues with one person having control of the social media accounts, and then that one person, for whatever reason, being not a good person, and or one person having access to the bank accounts, or one person who controls all the funds and nobody's really overseeing that, or anything that could potentially have an adverse negative effect on the organization ideally should have a point person and an overseer. And those should be two different persons. So, for your social media accounts, you have two people manage it. You have two administrators for it. one person might be the one who's doing 99% of the posts and the other person's just there if something goes wrong, but you have two people. Same with your bank account. You'll have two people every time, for the Kansas City Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts, for example. I am the executive director. I'm the one writing all the checks. I'm the one charging all the things on the credit card, et cetera. But we have a treasurer who every month is looking at all of my transactions. And every time I write a check, he sees an image of it. Every time I cash a check, he sees an image of it. And if something doesn't line up or something I didn't make enough of a note to make it clear what it is, he will email me and he'll be like, this $21.25 in miscellaneous, what is that for? And then I'll be like, oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah, I did our annual report with the Missouri Secretary of State, and I didn't notate that when I put it in there. But right. He's, just over there kind of making sure. He's like, hey, where'd you spend that money? And it's not particularly onerous for me, and it's not particularly onerous for him. And I'm not really interested in embezzling, but it's a way to have that check and balance to kind of make sure that doesn't happen. So those are a couple of things that I see a lot. And then the other thing that I see a lot is people just failing to file annual reports, failing to file tax returns with the IRS, missing deadlines and things like that. The IRS, if you are granted tax exempt status, if you fail to file your 990 return for 3 consecutive years, so 3 years in a row, they'll revoke your tax exempt status. And getting that reinstated most of the time means you start over.
Aye.
And so, I have on my personal Google Calendar, for example, reminders, like every March 1st, it pops up and it's like, file the 990, and so something like that, so that somebody is making sure that all of those, T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. Because we want to maintain that tax exempt status. That was what a lot of the nonprofits have really worked for, because they're soliciting grants, they're soliciting donations or corporate sponsorships. And the way that they are able to obtain those things is by having a tax exempt status with the federal government. So maintaining those things is very important. And it's really easy to let those slip through the cracks. And nobody's meaning to, and it just happens. Right. So having a process for that is important.
Crisis is always important. We're just about out of time, but I wanted you to share that there's an upcoming event in June that folks can try to participate in. Give us the quick shtick.
Yeah, so we do annually the UMKC School of Law, who I represent, Stinson Law Firm, which is one of the larger firms here in Kansas City, and the American Association of Corporate Counsel. We put on an event annually, as well as with Kansas Legal Aid and United Way, a event where we pair nonprofit organizations with a team of both Stinson attorneys and American Corporate Counsel attorneys to address some nonprofit issues in a one-day clinic. So the attorneys and the clients meet for 2.5-ish hours. And so whatever the issue is, it needs to be something we can kind of wrap up in 2.5-ish hours. If you are an attorney that it has a limited license and you're interested in doing some transactional work and you're not a member of the American Association of Corporate Counsel, if you become a member, you can participate. If you're a Stinson attorney listening, you should participate. And then if you are a nonprofit, we're actually at this point, our applications, I think we've exceeded the number of people that we can take this year, but we will do it again next year. So be on the lookout in like March, April. An invitation will go out and you can apply. And if you have something like, we need someone to review our bylaws and tell us how to amend them, that's a great project for this type of clinic. Or we're thinking about hiring employees and we don't know what we're supposed to do. Like, what are some tips with that? Great thing for this clinic. So, that's some types of things that you could consider doing. It's completely free. The legal services are free. They give you lunch at the end.
Where's the where's the best place for people to go check so that maybe next year they can stay in the loop, or, in between they might be able to reach out?
So this year and last year, we have posted it on Nonprofit Connect. They have kind of like a bulletin board sort of thing. It's on Nonprofit Connect. It's also been on Stinson's LinkedIn page and the American Association of Corporate Council's LinkedIn page, as well as Stinson's website. Stinson markets it pretty heavily, but if you're not following Stinson, you're not going to necessarily run across it. People can always contact me, and I can get them hooked up with that. But then the other thing is that if you are a nonprofit and you have a legal issue, please just reach out to me. I do nonprofit issues through UMKC's School of Law Clinic. And so there's some stuff that I might be able to help you with through the UMKC School of Law. I might be able to tell you to participate in this clinic coming up in the summer with Stinson and the ACC, or I might have other resources for you. So I'm pretty open to taking emails and answering people's questions and at least trying to direct them to the right resources for them if I can't personally help them through my clinic.
Please share how they can reach you. I assume by email is the best.
Yes. So my direct email is Merrick, my last name, DA, the first two initials of Danielle, at umkc.edu. Or the clinic's email is elsclinic@umkc.edu. So the acronym for Entrepreneurial Legal Services Clinic at umkc.edu. You can call and leave a message. I will eventually return your message, but I tend to be in meetings a lot of the day. But the phone number is 816-235-6341. And that's the best way to reach me. And like I said, I'm happy to answer questions, direct to resources. I actually go and speak to nonprofit boards on a somewhat regular basis. So if you're a nonprofit and you're like, I'd like someone to come and talk to my board about board responsibilities and board liabilities, I'm like, yeah, I can come and do that. So I speak to nonprofit boards about legal issues as well, just to give nonprofit organizations a better understanding of everything that's required of them.
Danielle, thank you. This has been great. I feel like I just went to a mini law class and you didn't charge me, which was even better. So thank you for sharing your expertise. We're really grateful for all you've shared with us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you for joining us for KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, also a nonprofit. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing, Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. You can spread the love and find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And check out our website at www.kccaresonline.org. You can find Danielle and all of our expert podcasts right there. And don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM, 8 a.m. Thanks for joining us on KC Cares.